Albert Camus. I like to consider his philosophy, and Camus is probably the most contemporary philosopher that we've looked at so far in this series. We've been trying to present figures in the history of philosophy. We started with the ancient Greeks, spent some time there, and then jumped forward into the modern era. And then the last presentation we did was on Friedrich Nietzsche. And now we want to try and look at Camus. I think Camus follows in the same line of philosophy, the same type of philosophy as Nietzsche did, although there's a lot of similarities, but also some interesting differences, which we'd like to talk about a little bit. I mean, his years here, 1913 to 1960, places him in what we'd say is contemporary philosophy. He's still a well-known philosopher, writer, and probably most remembered for his novel, The Stranger, which is a strange tale. But I mean, he addresses the same kinds of problems that Nietzsche did. I mean, one of the things we said, Nietzsche is also continues to be of interest to contemporary thinkers, just as Camus does. They're of interest because they address kind of life in modern times and the difficulty of life in modern times, how to make sense out of our existence as human beings. And now, especially after it seems no longer tenable, this isn't true for everyone, but no longer intellectually, it seems hard to embrace the old religions and the older conceptions of God and to find meaning in those kinds of teachings in the age that we live in now. It's also a kind of distrust of approaches to that question, the question of meaning, I mean, from purely rationalistic perspectives. And this sort of kind of recognition in both Nietzsche and Camus that human existence is more than just mental. I mean, it's not just mind, but there's our physical nature, our emotional nature has to be included in whatever conceptions we're going to come up with. I mean, to understand who we are, or what we are, and what our possibilities are. So they can continue to be of interest. Nietzsche's solution, if I risk, simplifying it, ended up being a kind of self-overcoming. Nietzsche claimed that we're human, all too human, so it's like to be a human being is like an unfinished project, and that we have to take on the task of finishing ourselves, or making something of ourselves, creating meaning for ourselves. You get this creative element, in some sense, an employment of the imagination in order to do that. We'll say Camus is addressing the same problem. I mean, the modern notion that life is basically meaningless, that there's nothing in the world of nature that we can appeal to find meaning for our existence, that we can't appeal to the beyond in order to justify our existences or find meaning there. Yeah, so you have to find some other way of resolving that search for meaning. And as I said, Nietzsche found a way, it seems like, and whether it's one that's acceptable or not is up to each. I mean, but Camus has his own way of resolving this, which is a bit different from what Nietzsche came up with. So I think that's what makes him interesting. He speaks to the modern man, modern mentality, and he discusses it. He's, philosophically without being too philosophical. I mean, he's a writer. It seems he's a thinker, and he's also a writer. And he doesn't write much in the way of traditional philosophy. He did write a few philosophical essays, but a lot of times it's kind of creative, you know, literature. He writes novels, and you could say clearly there's a lot of thought in those novels, and Camus is trying to convey something about how he sees reality and what it's about and how to, what kind of attitude can we have towards the existence that we do have in order, in some sense, to rise above, to give, help us understand what's possible for ourselves. Anyhow, that's going to be what this presentation is aiming at. We'll see if we succeed or not. Two major topics included are going to be the myth of Sisyphus, an ancient myth that Camus repopularizes, you might say, and he didn't invent this myth, but his interpretation of it sort of seems apt to the modern situation. And then, the myth itself is kind of obvious, the mention of it, but where Camus' interpretation of it and sort of is kind of unique. And also lurking in the midst of it all is this notion of the absurd, part of the meaninglessness of contemporary existence, is expressed in what Camus calls the absurd. And, we'll spend a little bit of time trying to express how he sees that, and then what the possible solution might be. So let's see what we can come up with on our analysis of it all, and if we can make some sense out of it. Well, let's begin by taking a look at what Camus has to say about the absurd. He is sometimes referred to as an absurdist. So to say that something is absurd is like saying it's ridiculous or it's irrational. It doesn't make any sense. For Camus, the absurd is the result of the confrontation between human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. We live in the world, we have things that we want, but what the absurd situation is that we can't have the things that we want, or that the world's not going to make those available for us. What do we want? You would say most significantly, we want to live, but the unfortunate truth for all of us is that we have to die. Also, you could say that we want a kind of clarity in terms of our understanding, but almost nothing is absolutely clear to us. Thirdly, we could also say that we want our lives to be meaningful. Maybe that's part of the above in a way. But again, the world doesn't provide any ways for us to find meaning in our relationship with it. You can say finally also we want the warmth and comfort of human interaction. But kind of ridiculously, it seems like all our interactions with others are superficial and perfunctory. We're self-absorbed. It's hard for us to be open, to receive what it is that we really want from others. So basically, you could say it's absurd that nature should give us these desires or these basic desires which are natural for us to have, and yet nature won't provide any means for the satisfaction of these desires. There's kind of a fundamental contradiction between ourselves and the world that we live in. And we could also say that there's a fundamental contradiction within ourselves as well. So really, it's absurd. Camus appeals to ancient Greek drama and mythology and finds in the myth of Sisyphus what he thinks is a suitable metaphor for the absurdity of the human situation. It's a pretty well-known myth, which tells the story of Sisyphus, and who was a human who was punished in the afterlife by being forced, to roll a boulder up a mountain. And when he would get the boulder to the top of the mountain, it would get away from him and roll back down to the bottom. And it became Sisyphus's task and the whole of his existence to repeat this process again and again, and kind of endless labor that could have no positive result, or so it would seem. So you could say that's illustrates the absurdity of human existence. Human beings work day after day all their life in order to try and achieve things, to find something satisfying for themselves, or to create some kind of significance for themselves, for their existence. But in the end, they inevitably face death, and it's all undone. So it's just kind of exercise in futility. So this is a popular story. There's a couple of illustrations of it we'll follow here. To give some life to this metaphor, we can look at a couple of artistic representations of Sisyphus. And originally, the myth was well known, but not applied or not thought of in the way that Camus is suggesting it. It can be thought of to represent the human situation. So, from the time of Homer and his story about Sisyphus and why he was condemned to this drudgery, a lifetime or more than a lifetime of drudgery, an eternal kind of drudgery existence. So one of the first significant artistic representations of the myth is from the artist Titian back during the Renaissance. I think this one's dated just about 1550. And here you can see, what's interesting about this is how immersed Sisyphus is in the darkness and in the earth. he's really much at the lowest level of existence for a human being, sort of trapped there, forced to do this hard physical backbreaking labor day after day, and the end result is it's undone at the end of the day, and he has to come back and start it over again the next day. You can see in the darkness there's the suggestion, I mean, of demon-like figures. This takes place in the underworld. So and the explanation for it is that it's a kind of punishment because Sisyphus didn't pay sufficient attention to the gods, or else he sort of ignored them, or didn't think that they were important really to pay attention to. And so he incurred their wrath, and this was the end result of the anger of the gods. We'll talk a little bit more about the reasons for it. I mean, but it's the situation is presented as a kind of punishment. I'm not sure that's how Camus wants to talk about it. It's not a punishment. It's just kind of a metaphor for the state of affairs for human beings. Let's look at the next one. This image is painted, I think, about 370 years later. It's a painting by Franz von Stuck, and it's kind of on the verge of expressionist movement in art. But here again, it just is testimony to the lasting interest in this myth, this story of Sisyphus. And you can ask the question, why the fascination with this image, or with this story about this endless labor. You can see here again, it's clearly it looks as though it represents Sisyphus as being punished, and style is quite different from Titian's. You see the background is red, which I think is supposed to indicate kind of that this is a kind of hell, and that the existence that Sisyphus has, I mean, to have this punishment put on him sort of places him in a kind of hell. So then, again, what's the sense of this, or what's the attractiveness for this image for us in a way? And then you can say that what Camus does with it is kind of like saying human existence is a kind of hell, or human existence is just endless suffering, really. And we kind of kid ourselves if we think we're accomplishing things with the difficulties that we face and struggle with in life. I think, there's a question that is raised in Camus, and his appeal to this metaphor raises that question, and that is, what's it all about? What is life about? Is there a meaning to life? And if you say there is no meaning to it, then does that mean that life is hell? Because it looks like it's fundamentally nothing that we do sort of ultimately has a lasting consequence or result for us. So I think that's a question that's in play in the way that Camus thinks about this particular image. There is, we haven't gotten into it, but for Camus, I mean, the first really philosophical question is that if life is absurd, and if Sisyphus is an emblem for what life is for us as human beings, and the question would be, why would Sisyphus continue? if you see that life is meaningless, why continue with it? Why not commit suicide? And so it's like Camus feels like that's a question that you have to ask at the very beginning. I mean, why bother with all the trouble? And Camus doesn't spend all that much time on it because he sort of rejects that option as a kind of just another cop-out. It doesn't solve anything. And so he thinks, you have to take on the challenge of life. And for him, there's different forms of suicide that people can adopt. I mean, he talks about intellectual suicide, where people end up believing in things. They delude themselves about religion, and is just the most prominent example I can come up with at the moment. But that's kind of intellectually, you believe in something, or convince yourself that there's some ultimate goal for all this. And it's just another way of like lying to yourself, which in a way is being dishonest, and is a kind of negative solution to the challenge of living. So I think this question of what the myth and Camus' application of it sort of raises the question about why should we live, and he's not suggesting that we shouldn't. He thinks that there is something that a way of rising above, what looks like just pure drudgery and dreariness for Sisyphus, depending on how Sisyphus relates to it all. So that's what we want to try and see in terms of how Camus is going to resolve this. Camus asks, what was Sisyphus's crime? Why was he punished? And we've added our own little question. Does it really matter why, in a way? Because the way Camus is going to use this metaphor. But if we look at Sisyphus as a historical figure, he was apparently the king of Corinth, and wasn't a particularly good guy or nice guy. That apparently he cheated people on occasion, and sometimes even killed them. But it doesn't seem as though that was the reason why he was punished in the afterlife. More likely, he was punished because he had a disdain for the gods, and he sort of ignored them and didn't pay them any attention. So that was offensive, doubtless. Also, he had and exhibited an inordinate passionate love for life, and kind of in this almost equally passionate hatred of death. So he loved life and he hated death passionately. And he was said to have been the cleverest of men. And it was this cleverness which enabled him to deceive the gods on a few occasions. And he was able to evade his own death, and was kind of went to the afterlife at one point and managed to get a pardon to go back and do something with his wife, and then he refused to go back to the afterworld again. So he just took advantage of all the situations he could in order to continue his life. Finally, they caught up with him, and he had to face the price for his attitude about these things. I think when Camus sort of lists his characteristics, his cleverness, not just his cleverness, but also his consciousness are going to be positive qualities. His disregard of the gods, his love of life, his hatred of death, his cleverness, and his consciousness were all characteristics that would have been admirable to for Camus. Also, I think in the end you could say that what Sisyphus was is he was a rebellious human being, and he both despised and deceived the gods, and that's why he got the punishment that he got. I asked the second question, does it matter? I mean, for us it doesn't matter so much because it's not really the idea of punishment that we're trying to look at. It's sort of the metaphor of the myth of Sisyphus as a way of referring to or thinking about the existence of human beings. That's what the question is for ourselves. Anyhow, let's move on. What Camus is interested in is what's going on inside the mind of Sisyphus as he goes through this experience. He's especially interested in that, and in particular he's interested in the moment when Sisyphus gets the rock up to the top of the mountain and it rolls back down. So that has to be a kind of pause or provide an interval. It would be like a moment when Sisyphus can reflect on what his situation is. The moment of lucid understanding. This word lucid is important for Camus, lucidity. It's one of the things that he's aiming at in order to try and rise above whatever our situation is in life, to have a kind of lucid understanding of it. So, lucid understanding, kind of clarity with respect to the truth of his situation, the truth of his fate. Here's where Sisyphus can rise above it all and choose not to be burdened by it or not to be taken down by it passively, but to actively take it up, acknowledge his reality, accept it, and thus rise above it. At the bottom, he re-engages with the rock again, and willingly. He feels its weight, senses its roughness and against his shoulder, and exerts himself again, fully engaged. So this is the moment in the pause at the top of the mountain when the rock gets away and Sisyphus has to walk back down the mountain to start over again. Sisyphus can become clear about what he's involved with and can take it on instead of just suffering it passively. He can experience it actively, and because of that, because of his lucid consciousness, he can become more than what he was. Towards the end of his treatment of Sisyphus, Camus alludes to another classic figure, Oedipus, and comments that they're both tragic figures, we recall that we talked about Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy and his take on the story of Oedipus the king. You could say that both Sisyphus and Oedipus are tragic figures, or I think Camus wants to think of them as tragic heroes. Not tragic because of the suffering that they endured, but tragic because of their consciousness and acceptance of that suffering. At the end of Oedipus Rex, Nietzsche points out, and Camus returns to it. I mean, Sophocles describes Oedipus, after all is said and done, blind and walking with Antigone, being led by Antigone, his daughter, and also his sister. And the tragic figure says, despite so many ordeals, my advanced age and the nobility of my soul make me conclude that all is well. Earlier, before Oedipus understood, you could say that he was blind on the inside, blind to the truth of who he was and his destiny on the inside. But now that he's physically blind to the outside world, he sees it all clearly and accepts it, comes to accept it anyhow. You could say that acceptance makes him, that consciousness and that acceptance makes him tragic. His lucid understanding makes him a tragic figure and enables him to somehow rise above what he's been, so it elevates him. You could say the same for Sisyphus, that his lucid understanding of his own situation and his acceptance of it and his active engagement with the futile task which has been assigned to him sort of elevates him as well. Here we have an image of Oedipus and Antigone leading Oedipus. The painting enhances the dramatic effect of the story. And really, it's for the sake of the dramatic effect that we have these two characters, not Antigone so much, but Oedipus, and then on the other hand, Sisyphus as the featured figures, one for Nietzsche and the other for Camus to focus on. Both these two figures, you could say, end up being portrayed as tragic heroes. In a way, what's significant about them is that they're bigger than life characters, and they each have really sort of morose stories surrounding them. And nonetheless, at the end, we have Oedipus say all is well somehow. And then we have, Camus has this suggest that we think of Sisyphus as happy. So we have these two, and they provide these bigger than life characters for us, examples for us. And you could ask, I mean, what are we supposed to take from these stories? And what's the message which is being given to us by these two authors? I would say, I mean, our lives compared to these two figures are ordinary existences. You know, we just have individual lives. Nothing quite measures to the drama that of the story of Oedipus or the story of Sisyphus. Nonetheless, we could say, you know, that they are images that are somehow intended to help us understand what we are and kind of what's possible for us in relationship to the life that we live. Our existences are ordinary, but if we allow them to be just ordinary, if we allow our lives to be determined by forces outside of ourselves, then you could say that that's a real tragedy. So it's only when we become aware of ourselves and aware of the reality of our existences that our stories can be altered, that it's possible for us, that if we not be bogged down or weighed down by the difficulties that we face, we'll suffer one way or the other, but it's possible for us to take on the sufferings that are part of our existence. And by taking them on, become active and not just passive. So something in the process of becoming active in relationship to the lives that we live, we can be raised up, we can be elevated, we can be something more than we are. And I think that's what is the message that both Camus and Nietzsche sort of would like us to take from these two storylines. It's hard to say things better than Camus himself does. So here, in his own words, delivered at the end of the notes on the myth of Sisyphus, he states, "I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again, but Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth, without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." We can try to draw some of our own conclusions from all this. Now we're going to start with this phrase, "One always finds one's burden again." I don't know, I think you look at this and you say, this is not a message from Camus and from Nietzsche, not a message for Oedipus or not a message for Sisyphus, but a message for ourselves. Each of us has our own difficulty in life, something that we have to struggle with in order to live our lives. And we may try to avoid that difficulty, forget it, procrastinate about it, or just, try to ignore it and so forth, but we'll always find it again. So the metaphor or the examples put before us by Oedipus and also by Sisyphus, although pretty dramatic, I mean they're still for us to benefit from. The second thing I would comment on is that Camus claims that Sisyphus teaches us a higher fidelity. You could say, this statement is significant in a number of regards. You say, with this statement, it seems as though Camus is negating nihilism. It's not true that if there is no God, all things are permitted. This is probably why Camus is sometimes called a moralist, not a morality based on a belief in God or some instruction from the beyond, but a morality based on some higher sensibility within ourselves, a kind of recognition that tells us we need to live our lives to the fullness. It's kind of respect for ourselves and a respect for others. We need to live our life completely, and we need to let others be free to do the same thing. So that's a pretty significant contribution, I think, or explanation of Camus' point of view. And thirdly, as Camus would have it, I mean, Sisyphus, again, after all is said and done, like Oedipus, is going to conclude that all is well. Camus wants to say in the end that Sisyphus is happy. It's his existence is not meaningless because he has given it meaning by taking on the labor for himself, by immersing himself in it, embracing it, by agreeing to live it and to live it sort of wholeheartedly. So that's, nihilism is gone by the way. Meaningless of life has also gone by the way. We don't get meaning from nature or from a divine source, but we get it from our own relationship with our own reality. Thus we can say that Camus, and with Oedipus as well, turn their fates on their heads, so it looks like a fate that is horrible has become a fate which enables the subject of it to rise above that situation, gives us an opportunity to become something more than what we were. So when he says that the struggle to the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, I mean, that's also a beautiful poetic expression, that the work that we put into trying to do what we feel like we need to do, and not to be taken down by the difficulties we face in life, but to view them as opportunities for us to grow. So. Just a couple of more thoughts or afterthoughts on Camus. Some of these points are not stated explicitly, but they're definitely there in between the lines, so to speak. First point I'd like to make is that Camus is advocating living in the present moment. And you could say not in your regrets about the past or your hopes and fears about the future, but in the here and now of the moment. And the here and now means in the here and now of our embodied natures. It's kind of elemental even, includes the physical aspect of our presence. And we could take note of the examples that we've looked at of Oedipus and then of Sisyphus as well. I mean, to see examples of that, especially in the case of Sisyphus. So live in the present moment. Secondly, and live in community with others, where our life is in community with others. And this had Camus' recognition of the importance of this included living in a community with others who are trying to achieve a goal in common, in a way. He gives, there's some examples of this. You could say Camus in his youth was a soccer player, a good soccer player actually. And he claimed that everything that he learned about morality and obligation, he learned from playing soccer. So you see this being a member of a team and having working together to accomplish a good showing in the sport. I mean, taught him a lot about camaraderie, how to be with other people and how to get something from it, how to learn something from it. You could say another thing that Camus was interested in throughout his life was being involved in the theater. He wrote plays and he was, from early on, engaged in theatrical creation and production. Again, working together with others for a very distinct end, the performance or the performances and so forth. Again, the same sense of being together and working together to achieve something. We could also include the fact that he played his part in the French resistance during the Nazi occupation of France and Paris. He was an editor of an outlawed newspaper entitled Combat. So that was, being a part of a community. And that leads to the third point I'd like to make. I mean, now these examples that I've just talked about, living in the community, we don't see that so much in the examples we've examined. It's not very obvious in the story of Oedipus, nor in the story of Sisyphus as well. But in Camus' own life, I think that's an important aspect of it. So not living an isolated existence, such as you might see in the philosophy of Nietzsche and also in Dostoevsky. I think of Notes from the Underground, or in the stories of Franz Kafka. I mean, these are all kind of isolated individuals and their struggles to make sense out of their own existence. It's kind of like this higher fidelity that we spoke about is awakened through interaction with others, a kind of a sense of morality, an appreciation for life and for freedom, for oneself, but not just for oneself, but for others as well. a kind of obligation or a sense that, whatever our life presents us with, we should try to live life fully and do whatever seems to be necessary to do that. Taking on the difficulty of life is part of that. It's not necessarily a solitary activity, although one has to deal with it within oneself. I'll end with this this quote, which I always liked from Camus, and he says, "Don't walk in front of me. I might not follow you. Don't walk behind me. I might not lead you. Rather, walk beside me and be my friend." So let's leave it with that. Thank you.